Okay, well, I thank you for the invitation, and this is just a great opportunity. It's so nice to have a crowd this small and sort of this much in alignment in terms of our interests. Great to have an opportunity to share ideas in this sort of intimate setting. So I really look forward to the dialogue that we'll engage in over the next couple of days. Conferences generally, especially hate crime conferences, tend to be very stimulating. You go back and you have big ideas and more energy. But I think of this sort of symposium even more so because it hopefully will be that much more intensive. The title has changed, but the theme is pretty much the same. I can't even remember what the original title was now. Moving Beyond Hate, I think. Yeah, and it's very much the same sort of thing. But because I've integrated some of the dialogue from recent research participants, I thought that it was important to talk about in terms of speaking of hate, not just as practitioners and scholars, but also from the perspective of victims and vulnerable communities. That's sort of the new piece. And what I want to do here is, in some respects, trace again the arguments I made in that earlier paper on the semantics of hate, adding in this empirical piece to see what that adds to our consideration of hate crime. Like Gail Mason in an earlier paper, I want to raise some questions about hate as a heuristic device for understanding the problem that confronts us here. When I teach my course on hate crime, I begin every semester, not maybe the first day, but certainly the first full lecture, by distancing myself from this term, hate crime, and explaining to students what my dissatisfaction is with the term. And over the course of the semester, we come back to that on a fairly regular basis, talking about what the limitations are in terms of how it both informs and is informed by public dialogue as well as political dialogue. I want to talk a little bit about then hate as what I see as sort of a misnomer, a very poor proxy for the sorts of violence and the sorts of motivating factors that we're really talking about here, moving it out of the sort of realm of the individual into the realm of the social and the structural and all the power relations that underlie it there. I write here that I have to agree with Nathan Hall when he writes that despite the frequency with which the term is used for the purpose of furthering our understanding of hate crime, the word hate is distinctly unhelpful. For all of our zeal to attack hate, we still have a remarkably vague idea of what hate actually is, and despite the powerful and emotional images that it involves, it is still far less nuanced an idea than prejudice, bias, bigotry, hostility, anger, or just a mere aversion to others. So he's one among others, I think, who shares the discomfort with the term that we've come to be saddled with after 20, 25 years, 30 years of legislative and academic activity as well. Of course, the phenomenon that we're talking about is really not new, and there has been literature and there's been legislation around the sort of bigotry, the sort of violence against communities. In some cases it has been enabled, as lynching in the South, enabled by the agents of the justice system. In other contexts, it has been sort of confronted by the justice system, but nonetheless is not a new phenomenon. So I've been trying to trace really where the sort of origins of this notion of hate crime have come from, and I haven't been very successful. So perhaps that's one of the things in in your studies you'll find. When did we first coin this term that we're now left with? We know that it grew out of both the activism and legislative activities of the 80s in particular, and it's now become sort of institutionalized and enshrined in legislation and in the academy. But it's unclear to me why that term or where that term originated really. So just really quickly, I'm not going to read through this, but just to give you an idea of sort of the intertwining of some academic, but legislative and activist activity around the notion of hate crime from very early on. So I've highlighted, and this is from a U.S. perspective in particular, highlighted the years in which particular activist organizations that have become especially important in this area were established, and highlighted some of the legislative watermarks, if you will, as well, again, in the U.S. So we see that very little activity until the 80s in this area in any respect. Legislation, some state legislation through the beginning a little bit in the 70s, but really more through the 80s. I think we can say it in the U.S. the legislative activity really caught fire in 1990 with the signing of the Hate Crime Statistics Act, and multiple other states within the U.S. Quickly followed suit, as did most Western nations in terms of creating explicit and concrete hate crime legislation. Intended to address the problem that had been brought to the fore by so many of these activist organizations. So I think that in terms of the scholarship, we sort of lagged a little bit behind the activists and legislators in that respect. Very hard to trace anything. I did some quick searches of electronic databases trying to sort of track down academic activity in the area, and didn't see much published with this explicit term hate crime in it until the late 80s, probably corresponding to the conversations in the House around the need for hate crime legislation. So really, in terms of the academic approach, I think there was, 1991 was probably the watershed. This was the first sort of book-length manuscript that I could find. That's Robert Kelly's Bias Crime, American Legal Response, followed also by, the next year, by Herrick and Barrell's book on anti-gay violence, and then the following year by Levin and McDevitt's hate crime book as well. And then, of course, the most important watershed date, I think, is 2001, when In the Name of Hate was published. Just pat myself on the back there. Pardon me? I think it was, can't remember now, somebody from the States, I think. Okay. So here we find ourselves 20 years on or so in this field of hate crime as academics, as activists, and also in the legal field. And I think in historical hindsight, there are probably some very good reasons why hate crime, which I would argue is sort of a neutered term, was adopted. I think it was an era when sort of more politicized, more radical language would have found very hard purchase. This is in the U.S., the Reagan-Bush years, in the U.K., the Thatcher years. So it's also the era in which the end of history was declared, when terms like political correctness and identity politics were bandied about as a criticism, in fact, of self-conscious activity on behalf of or on the part of disadvantaged communities. So I think that it was going to be a hard slog to get anything else sort of on the public agenda, any other very self-conscious term on the agenda. So here I find myself so-called expert in an area whose label is sort of distasteful to me. So I continue to try and engage people in these sorts of conversations about, well, what other language and what other conceptualizations can we bring to the table to help us understand and make sense of something that is about much more than simply hate as an emotion, as it's commonly considered to be. So, as I say, I sort of want to trace back to that earlier paper on the semantics of hate, where I made these sorts of arguments, and in particular argued that four of the most problematic, I think, implications of some of the interpretations of hate are that they trivialize, individualize, pathologize, and depoliticize the violence that we're really interested in understanding and labeling in that respect. Excuse me. So the first, trivialization. And I use this, I hate broccoli, because very often amongst critics you see this sort of banal analogy drawn. Well then, what about, is there an organization for, asparagus supremacists or something who might assault those who prefer cauliflower, who prefer broccoli, whatever the case may be. So I thought that this was a useful image for this context here. Hate, it's an easy concept, right? Everyone understands, everyone agrees what hate is, or do they? My friend Neil Chakraborty and his colleague John Garland don't think so, nor do I. On the contrary, they argue hate is a slippery, emotive, and conceptually ambiguous label. Hate can mean different things to different people, and that has important implications for the way in which we conceive of the offenses that fall under its umbrella framework. Nathan Hall makes a similar argument. The simple four-letter word hate, in fact, masks a multitude of complexities. Because of this, hate in its contemporary meaning actually refers to a variety of human emotions that are often far removed from real hatred. Yet in a great deal of public and political discourse, and one of my graduate students just discovered in the discourse of police officers in particular, hate then is often reduced to this idea of an emotion, something fairly simple, fairly base, like dislike, loathing, animosity. So it comes to be seen in narrow literal terms, that is, hate crime comes to be seen in very narrow literal terms as an outcome of an emotion or of a state of mind of an individual, which I'll come back to in a moment. As I've argued previously, I think that this really misses the point and minimizes the import and the impact of the violence that we're concerned with here. They occlude the distinction between the popular dictionary meaning of the term hate and the sociological understanding of hate, which really motivated our attention to this issue. Luan Wang, especially in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, was especially forceful, I think, in her condemnation of these sorts of interpretations, arguing that the misuse of the notion of hate has been used to simplify and to distort the understanding of hate. And as an example, I offer a statement by Doherty, or question posed by Doherty, which comes back almost to the broccoli thing. What if a crime is found to have been motivated by hatred of the victim's material success or superior physical or mental abilities? What about the vast number of crimes undeniably motivated by vindictiveness and hatred inspired in the perpetrator due to a virtually limitless list of personal wounds and offenses inflicted by the victim? For me, this is an oversimplified analogy. She's really talking there about the individualized, isolated hatreds of the normal, everyday sort, the individual sort, directed towards an individual as an individual, not as a member of an identifiable group. So these are not the group hatreds or the identity-based hatreds that is intended by this notion, this phrase associated with hate crime. The consequence of the distortion, this sort of distortion, is that it opens the door really for critics of even sort of, especially around legislating hate. So critics of the legal notion of hate crime are especially enamored, I would argue, of these sorts of interpretations, as it allows them to dismiss regulation as criminalizing emotion and thus not a legitimate intervention. Brian Roseberry, for example, asks, could we rightly be punished for having bad emotions or rewarded for having good ones? In a similar vein, Heidi and her colleague, argue that because hate and prejudice are emotional states and enduring character traits, hate bias crimes do necessarily punish a defendant for having bad character. In fact, they punish a defendant solely for bad character. So for me, this is, again, sort of that trivialization of the term. It's reducing it to an emotion, to thought, to attitude, to belief. And so we see titles of journalistic articles as well as academic articles such as Hate is Not a Crime, Bad Thoughts, Should Hate Be a Crime, with which I'm sure we're all familiar. And the text that accompanies such titles reinforce this tendency. So for example, it's utterly wrong-headed to make hate illegal. Isn't it enough that people be punished for what they do rather than for the attitudes that drive them to it? What is the advantage in prosecuting people for what amounts to crimes of wrong thinking? A crime is a crime. They all have to do with hate. And one of my favorites that actually my grad student has also heard, this is from work by Balboni and McDevitt, police officer says, having never seen a love crime, we view all crime as hate crime. And again, my student heard the same sort of sentiments. He was actually looking at whether violence against women might be considered by police officers as a bias-motivated crime. And the same sort of disavowal, if you will, came up there. So again, I would argue that very often these sorts of evasions are quite conscious, so that the motive and impact, if you will, of racist or other forms of bigoted violence are said to be uncontrollable emotions, a crime of passion. And to that extent, in some ways, it actually mitigates rather than elevates the intensity and the import of the issue. So if hate crime is considered then to be a reflection of emotion, it stands to reason that it's also interpreted as a very individual atomistic behavior. Then, certainly it could involve a group of young males, generally, but who nonetheless share that same belief, share, for unexplained reasons, share those attitudes or those biases, again, at a very personal and base level. And so Wang, again, says, the perpetrator's bias is personal. It's based in his own negative opinions or attitudes toward the targeted social group from this perspective. Again, this interpretation opens the door for criticism, since to punish these beliefs, I go back to Roseberry again, is to violate an irreducible sphere of privacy in which, if we're to enjoy minimal psychological integrity and self-respect, part of our inner life must lie beyond the reach of the law. So here the emphasis is on the psyche of the individual, regardless of their cultural context. It's the individual's inner life that must be protected from the intrusions of the state. Mason, again, highlights this sort of individualistic response, particularly in her critique of certain psychological perspectives on hate crime, which she argues focus on the ways in which alterity functions in an interpersonal sense. Put very simply, this means that they are influenced by a more psychic or internal sense of the self-other binary, particularly with the idea that we all have a deep-seated fear of the difference that reside within us. So think about psychological perspectives that speak of projection, for example, or repression, where one's own insecurities are projected onto the potential victim as a means of repressing or perhaps punishing in an odd sort of way their own fears or their own uncertainties about their own identities, especially in the context of anti-gay violence, right? Repressing their own sexuality, questionable sexuality. Again, the difficulty here is that the motive is internal. And internalized rather than external to the offender. And so it's a singular act of a particular individual. He typically becomes the outlier, the deviant, hate-filled extremist who acts on his own deeply held hostilities toward the victim's group. So it's this pathologization, I think, that is very much connected to that process of individualization and parallels that tendency as well. So the extremist noted above, the lone wolf, is a fairly common descriptor, referring to individual deviance in that respect, someone who is outside the norms of, or the bounds rather, of normal behavior. So they're acting out some delusional fantasies or some extreme emotions as outlined earlier in the first part of the section. And so again, this is the second half of Wang's equation, wherein the perpetrator's bias is deviant and irrational, is abhorrent, and aberrant, and it makes no logical sense. And I think this was obvious in some treatments of Breivik's attacks in Norway. I did a lot of interviews in Canada after those attacks, and the leading question was always, could it happen here? As if no, the assumption was no, of course it couldn't, because this was the act of one very sick man, one very pathological individual. It couldn't possibly happen in a country as peaceful and wonderful and multicultural as Canada. So again, it puts him and others like him outside the bounds of normal. So Goldberg says that the hatred to which we refer is assumed to be irrational, abnormal, and unusual. So that encourages us to come to a view of racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism, whatever the case may be, as a result of, again, pathological individuals rather than embedded in institutional practices and offending communities. So pathology here implies deviance irrationality, sickness. There's something comforting about this in some respects, because it allows us to distance ourselves from the violence and from the offender. He's not like us. He's not a reflection of us. It's just an outcome of a sick mind. However, I'd argue, and many others, Goldberg, for example, would argue as well, that the hate of which we speak is not necessarily irrational. And it's certainly not abnormal. It's certainly not unusual in our culture, unfortunately. Hate is not simply grounded in a mental state, nor is it the outcome of extreme hostility and pathology. Often it's foreseeable, and it is quite rational, at least from the perpetrator's worldview. So if you think about anti-gay violence, for example, it could be, but it's not necessarily, a direct outcome of someone's hostility or hatred or fear of the gay other or transgendered other or whatever the case may be, but if it's drawn from a particular interpretation or reading of Scripture or other religious passages, then perhaps there is rationality to it, not irrationality. It's not informed by individual emotions, but by a systemic interpretation of, in that case, homosexuality is sin, for example. So racist violence, homophobic violence, anti-Semitic violence, all these forms that we're talking about are not necessarily irrational in decidedly racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic cultures. It's wholly rational, given a whole array of supporting practices and structures of collective belief. In institutionalized discourses in our society that minimize or victimize the others in our midst. Hate crime, as I'll argue a little more fully later, is nested in a web of everyday practices used to marginalize and disempower targeted communities. So it's more than just the behavior of hateful and misguided individuals. It is systematic and systemic. It resonates with a network of norms, assumptions, and behaviors and policies that are structurally connected so as to reproduce identity-based hierarchies. Nothing new in this. This is the argument I've been making for 10 years now, 15 years now. So in this respect, hate crime, as I argued, is as rational, as normal, as usual, as alternative mechanisms for marginalizing, disempowering disadvantaged communities, such as stereotyping, employment segregation, those sorts of more normalized practices, if you will. So together then, these tendencies that I've just described mean that hate and hate crime is also depoliticized in that context. Or as Wang has argued, these sanitized understandings fail to account for the situational factors that contextualize them. Emphasizing individual pathologies occludes the social pathologies that inform and shape the behaviors that we're talking about here. Hate's a strong sentiment. It's also a relatively strong sentiment for the same reasons that pathologization is useful. The use of this term hate, again, allows us to deny that it is structured within these patterns of oppression, again, that I'll talk about in a moment. Does not require us to admit that bias-motivated violence is constituted of and by difference, that it's about race and racism and homophobia and all those other things that are embedded in our society. Rather, this interpretation removes hate crime from the realm of cultures of violence into the realm of the psychology of violence. So these tendencies that I've just described obscure the realities that perpetrators' bias is socially reinforced and not simply personal. It's much more than the act of individual racists or homophobes. It's part of and symptomatic of larger patterns of intergroup conflict and especially of subordination. It's embedded in a particular context, structural and cultural context, and nested in what Marilyn Frye has referred to as the birdcage of oppression. When I was working with doing work on Native Americans in particular, I was very much taken by Iris Marion Young's notion of the 5 faces of oppression, which recognize the extent to which multiple mechanisms of subordination and discrimination were again sort of nested together. So she talked about the 5 faces being marginalization, disempowerment. I always forget one. exploitation, marginalization, disempowerment, and cultural imperialism, and then the fifth of those pillars being the violence, the systemic violence that we're talking about here. So those structural factors like marginalization, disempowerment, exploitation provide the context, if you will, and the cultural imperialism provides the justification for the violence that we're talking about. So again, they're nested together. So the violence arises out of those patterns rather than individual belief systems. So again, it's not an individual pathology that we're talking about here, but an outcome of oppressive social patterns. Okay, so I want to turn now to sort of the novel piece, the new piece of this paper, and that is this piece, In Their Own Words, looking at the voices of the vulnerable, as I've framed it here. So I think that the critics are maybe disingenuous in their insistence that a hate crime, that a crime is a crime is a crime, is best illustrated through the voices of vulnerable communities. And again, victims, but also those living, as you mentioned, those living in fear of becoming victims of hate crime. Because the work that this draws from is a study that I did precisely on that, that is on the community impacts of hate crime, looking at how not just the immediate victims, but also the distal victims and the vicarious victims responded to acts of violence in their communities and on their communities, if you will. So the significant questions here, it was survey-based research, but I had a couple of open-ended qualitative questions as well. And so most of these responses are grounded in two opening questions, one of which was, how would you define hate crime? What do you think hate crime is? The second one is, how do you explain hate crime? Why does it happen? Try and make sense of it from that perspective. And it became apparent through the participants' responses that, for the most part, members of these vulnerable communities, and they were 7 communities defined as vulnerable communities by the Ontario Hate Crime Community, no, Ontario Working, I can't remember. Some Ontario Working Group on Hate Crime. And these were the 7 communities in our area that they had identified. But it became clear from their voices that they were very much aware that the problems of violence that they faced were in fact systemic, that they were structurally grounded in historical and contemporary patterns, that they weren't necessarily just, again, isolated individual hatreds. Now, granted, there was, as you can see from this cluster, there were some who did define it in hate crime in these terms. That is, it was the outgrowth of individual hatreds. It was the outgrowth of individual issues or beliefs, those sorts of isolated sorts of behaviors. So due to jealousy, being insecure, no respect, less educated. So again, very individualistic explanations. The interesting one here, I think, is the one that, the quote from the South Asian female: ignorance, opportunity, gang affiliation, jealousy, envy. So there's all those individualistic factors. But then alongside that, you also see some recognition, some acknowledgement that in fact they are also grounded in broader patterns of racism, sexism, learned behavior. So again, they are systemic, they're endemic to our society. So I think that was a really interesting hybrid understanding, if you will. But then there were also a number that were quite explicit and quite quite explicit in their understandings of the foundations, the cultural foundations of hate crime, as you can see here. Living in a xenophobic society, it's not just about that person, any person, both in terms of the victim and the perpetrator. So again, coming back to the South Asian woman, racism, sexism, homophobia, institutional hate propagated by some religious and state laws, which is really interesting, just to recognize, for participants to recognize the role that that the state and the broader ideologies and sort of key institutions in society reproduce some of these problems as well. So these statements come from very diverse societies. I'm not even going to try and remember the 7 communities that we were talking about, but they're racialized communities as well as faith-based communities and LGBT communities as well. So they've lived a lifetime littered with barrages of racist epithets, harassment, violence on the basis of their identities. And so are fully aware that hate crime is intended to remind them of their place and their stigmatized identities. So I think this first one is a particularly strong statement there. So like Iris Marion Young that I mentioned before, these folks also recognize very much the ways in which say racial violence is embedded in other racialized patterns within society. They recognize that it's embedded in patterns of disempowerment. Marginalization is meant, in fact, to reinforce those patterns of marginalization, disempowerment. It's clear to them that offenders are not lashing out on the basis only of their own individual hostilities and dislikes, but those that are informed by, shaped by, conditioned by broader patterns in Western cultures. So what Ray and Smith might refer to as cultures of racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. Nope, they're already up there. I was just going to see if I had any other statements there from the groups. So the participants in the study acknowledge that hate crime is not simply an expression of hatred. They know fully well that it's intended to play a role in the broader exercises of power that reinforce their sense of inferiority or oppression. I've long made this argument that the intent of hate crime is to reassert the subordination of the victims and, more importantly, their communities as a whole. I've argued that through bias-motivated violence, perpetrators attempt to reaffirm their own dominant identities, their access, preferred and privileged access to resources, while at the same time limiting the opportunities of the victims to express their own needs and to attend to their own needs. So the performance of hate violence confirms those natural relations of superiority, inferiority. So in that sense, it's not a form of interpersonal politics or interpersonal exchange, but in fact of intercultural politics and intercultural boundaries, politics that signify boundaries, very dangerous boundaries that are often reaffirmed through violence. I think another indicator of the structural understanding of victims and potential victims is that they recognize the violence to which they're subject as oppressive. In the sense that it weighs them down. So this sort of language was often used, this notion of weighing down, of tiring out, of beating back through the daily experience of the victimization. So this one is especially powerful. Wears us down. Don't have to do anything. We're just there and someone calls us a lazy Indian or an Indian whore. And maybe they throw stuff, or one time someone spit on me. I didn't do anything. It's that stuff every day or every week that gets to me. I just don't want to have to face any white people. So it tires me out, weighs me down. And that was fairly consistent language amongst these folks, especially, and this is the interesting thing, I think we talk about this quite often in the literature, certainly in the literature on violence against women. And we know that most of the violence tends to be at the lower end of the scale. Harassment, racial epithets, verbal harassment, telephone harassment, all those sorts of things. But as these folks and people in my work with Native Americans indicate, it's that petty stuff that really wears down on them. It's those microaggressions on a daily basis that really repress them and keep them where they are. I've likened it to sort of a water torture, where those microaggressions are sort of the drip, 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 that just sort of wear a hole in your soul after a while. So in line with what Iris Marion Young argues, the persistent harassment and the threat of harassment that victims experience and vulnerable communities experience leaves them feeling disempowered, overwhelming, tired. As I said, it wears them down. A related effect of the violence is this, the reinforcement, as I've been arguing, the reinforcement of the sense of inferiority or lack of belonging, if you will, that victimized communities experience. So which one do I have here? Yeah, so the directly or indirectly directly made towards me. In my opinion, these crimes were left me feeling lesser than the other person, as they were directed attacks at my self-esteem and confidence. And again, a number of statements like this that it made me reconsider my place. It made me reconsider my worth in this society, the extent to which I was welcome in my community, those sorts of things. So again, that notion of inferiority reproduced through the violence. And the final sort of theme that comes up here, and again is one that began to emerge in my work with Native Americans, is the perception, if you will, of the normativity of the violence, that it's endemic in the lives and experiences of these communities. It comes to be expected and accepted almost, part of their daily experience. So this one, I think, is one such statement. Always will be and always have been discrimination in society, but it definitely changes constantly throughout the years. There are shifts and changes happening constantly depending on new laws, politics, and world events. Discrimination or a hate crime can and always will be used as a tool to try and control, dominate, or oppress a group or individual. So it's normative in the sense that it's a part of their daily experience, but also in the sense that combine the individual biography with the cultural biographies of their community. It's not just something that's always happened in their lives, it's something that's always happened in the lives of other members of their community. I don't think I have it here, but there's one that refers to, it happened to my parents, it happened to my grandparents, it's happened to me, it's going to happen to my kids. And that sort of fatalism and acceptance of the immutability of violence is especially disturbing, but also I think really highlights the extent to which it is structurally embedded and difficult to break out of. All right. So given my own reservations, given the observations that I draw from from vulnerable communities, both in my current work and older work, it brings us back to the question, where does this leave us? Right? If I'm not happy with this, where do we go from here? So again, Neil, in one of his latest books, mused over whether the uncomfortable fit of the term means we need to reject the concept outright. And I think we both agreed that that's a little extreme. I prefer his other option, which is, I quote, to reconfigure the label in terms of what it might more accurately represent. Therefore, if hate crime is not really about hate as such, but more about prejudice, bias, bigotry, or isms, as most scholars seem to suggest, then perhaps reconfiguring it something along the lines of prejudice crime or bias crime might help to capture the essence of what these crimes really center on. And that is, I think, goes in line with what Goldberg had argued about a decade earlier. Said it would be helpful to reconceive hate crimes and hate speech in terms of what they actually are. Violent acts of imposed power over those this culture and its members continue to marginalize as racial others. So these suggestions push us in the direction of thinking about sort of taking seriously the isms that Neil referred to. Sorry, lost my train of thought. That we focus on these isms that underlie the forms of violence, that we focus on those underlying patterns of violence to develop more self-conscious language around the issue at hand. Best of all possible worlds, when we're talking about isms, we would talk about racist violence, we would talk about anti-Muslim violence, we would talk about anti-gay violence, but as I suggested earlier, that's just unwieldy. If we want to talk about, sort of this collective form of violence, and to that extent, hate crime was a very handy shorthand term for us to, sort of develop a consensus around. Yep, we all know what we're talking about when we say hate crime. There's some agreement around that. But again, it's sort of a dissatisfying shorthand. I want us to look for language that captures the embedded exercises of power and control and difference that I've just described here. What we should aim for then is an alternative that seems to capture the deeply embedded exercises of social, cultural, and political power. So language that is more direct, that's more honest in its invocation of notions of themes of power, advantage and disadvantage, subordination, domination. So what I want to offer here is just really a shortened version of what I talked about in that previous paper, highlighting just a few terms that we might want to think about or that have been bandied about in the past. I sort of would reject bias crime and bigoted violence almost out of hand from the get-go, because for me they retain that individualistic flavor. So I sort of think of Archie Bunker in his armchair when I think about these sorts of things, rather than those broader patterns and ideologies and constructs that inform his what most of us understand as ironic and satirical comments. From the writer's perspective. So again, those are both, I think, a little sterile. They retain that sort of sterile, neutral, sanitized connotation and include the cultural resources that give such violence its life and meaning. One of the terms that has been used quite frequently, and I've used this a lot in recent years, is the notion of ethnoviolence coming out of the Prejudice Institute and Howard Ehrlich's work there. They've done a lot of work, of course, around workplace ethnoviolence and ethnoviolence on campus, that sort of thing. Excuse me, and I quite like this term. Literally, of course, is violence against the people, or I would argue, maybe a more accurate interpretation is violence against those people who are a threat to my children, or those people who don't think like us, or act like us, or believe like us, or talk like us, or look like us. So I've found this actually quite a useful shorthand term. But I think that it might be subject to the same sort of misinterpretations, if you will, or maybe not misinterpretations, but sort of literalist interpretations, so that purists might argue, that this term could be used or can exclude particular groups who are not identifiable as a traditional cultural group. So people with disabilities, women, gays, for example, who are not, because when we think of ethnos, we think of the people, right? It's sort of ethnic enclaves or racial enclaves, as opposed to these other sorts of communities. So another term that I'd throw out there is derived from Betsy Stenko's work on targeted violence, which I think is, again, another interesting term, another very useful term to think about. And this comes out of her work on everyday violence, of course, and looks at how the vulnerability of members of particular groups are targeted because of their relational disadvantage to their attackers. So she argues that the assailant chooses to hurt a particular victim in a way that an assailant can do because of who the victim is, in quotes, because the assailant can rely on the available resources available to a collectivity from historical, social, and economic legacies in order to do so, and because the assailant retrieves popular discourses that assist in justifying that such actions are legitimate in the eyes of some portion of a population. So again, this notion of targeted violence allows us to recognize that anti-immigrant violence, racial violence, whatever the case may be, are nested in that complex of relations and complex of social constructs and cultural constructs that enable the targeting and the victimization of particular communities in ways that either perpetuate or reconfigure hierarchies of social power. And again, shaped by broader cultural and political arrangements that, as Sheffield says, allocate rights, privileges, and prestige. Similar to that is the notion of systemic violence, which is drawn from Iris Marion Young's work that I mentioned earlier on, by which she means the random, unprovoked attacks on persons or property that have no motive but to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person. And given that, what I argued earlier about the 5 faces of oppression from Iris Marion Young's perspective, again, it recognizes the embeddedness of violence within those other patterns and practices associated with marginalization, disempowerment, exploitation. All together now, we must all know them. So again, another powerful term, another very useful term to the extent that it addresses many of my criticisms and the limitations that I've noted earlier on. I think related to that, given what I've said about victims' experiences and victims' interpretation of hate crime, the violence that they experience, and given the connections in Young's work with oppression, I think this notion of oppressive violence might be an option. Again, probably these terms are probably more useful as academic terms in the context of social, social scientific or philosophical attempts to understand it. Don't know to what extent how tidy this looks as a legislative title for an act. Can you imagine, an act to reduce oppressive violence? Yeah, I'm sure George Bush would be all over that. Stephen Harper, our own PM, would be all over that. Sure, he would. But I think nonetheless, from our own perspective, as maybe even as practitioners, as activists, and as academics, I think it's a very useful term for getting to the heart of these issues I've been talking about here. Another alternative that has been offered by Mark Ham, for example, is this notion of terrorism, hate crime as terrorism. Again, very powerful term, very politicized term. In the current era, of course, very evocative. When Ham was writing, of course, this was before September 11th, so the fear is that this is just not going to be an acceptable term in the contemporary context, in the current context, because people would resist, I think, comparing the 9/11 attacks with the daily experiences that we've described here. So I think that now has some serious limitations. As a catch-all phrase. Goldberg, almost in passing, has noted the sort of the adoption of language around crimes against humanity, human rights violations. A few years ago, I can't remember when it was, what year, a colleague and I, Swedish colleague, by the way, and I published a paper on hate crime as a human rights violation as well. So this is, I think, maybe a different way to look at it. And I've got to credit Paul Legansky with this one, because at one of the hate crime conferences in Nottingham a few years ago, we sort of at the last minute cobbled together a paper that really talked about hate crime itself as the harm, and we're trying to make sense of that. How do we make that? How do we articulate that argument? And this is where I started thinking about it. Well, hate crime is itself a human rights violation, and therefore the harm is endemic in the act itself. So I thank Paul for that. But I have, as I say, I have sort of worked a little bit in this area and started thinking about it in these contexts. I think there's a lot to be said for a human rights orientation to hate crime, to the extent that it's a fairly politicized term, so that's important. The practical utility of invoking a rights discourse is that it allows for recognition of the role of the state, as well as private actors in perpetuating forms of violence, so I think that that's really useful. It draws force and legitimacy from international law and convention, where so the Declaration of Human Rights, obviously, and subsequent conferences on genocide, an array of rights issues draw attention to human rights violation that inhere in intergroup violence across the continuum. And so it also, I think, to invoke rights claims generally is potentially transformative, in that the discourse of rights shifts the focus from violations of the person to violations of the body politic. So it invokes the collective identity-based nature of both the act and the harm done. So I'd say the exploitation of human rights narratives creates avenues by which the systemic subordination and victimization of minorities can be challenged, both in the legal realm and the marketplace of ideas. Okay, so this challenge to popular interpretations of hate then I think brings us to an important place. Brings us to a place of problematizing the term and opening up that discussion of, as I said earlier on, choosing language that is more direct, that is more honest, and evocation of themes of power, advantage, disadvantage, subordination, domination. So I'm not here to sort of argue for one or the other of these terms that we've talked about here, but to encourage us to think about alternatives that are more empowering? No, because I don't want to use that language, but that recognize that hate crime is a mechanism of empowerment and disempowerment, a mechanism of reproducing rigidly structured and hierarchical cultures. To recognize that the bigoted violence we talk about draws on cultural resources to gain motivation, meaning, and literature. So what I ask is that scholars be thoughtful in choosing terminology so the politics of difference that underlie hate crime becomes transparent So the question that I want to leave you all with is this: where does this take us? What is the impact of this problematization of the term for hate crime under the law? To some extent, I think it moves us a little bit away from the criminal law towards an emphasis on human rights law, which is not an absurd notion. I mean, much of the U.S. legislation, for example, originated within hate crime legislation. So, some of the early federal legislation in the states, for example, was intended to protect people exercising their federally protected rights and activities, such as voting. So violence that restricted those was held to a higher standard. So I think it's not necessarily a bad direction to go. So that's a question I leave you with, and I thank you for your time and consideration.
Okay, I will now totally abuse my power as a mic holder to ask a question, then I will open up for other questions. You addressed this issue at the end, that if we understand the attitude here as a more of a structural thing and not individualized, we get a problem if we have a hate crime law where the hate is aggravating, and we have to hold an individual responsible for it. It seems that if we have a structural explanation, that would rather be an excuse than an aggravation. Is that a problem? Do you think that
well, it is, and that I think is the typical tension between our academic understandings of hate crime and legislative responses to them. It's how do you embody this sort of understanding in legislation? That's why I think that it is more readily recognizable in the human rights legislation than it is in the criminal law in that respect, much as I indicated.
Right, but can you hold an individual responsible for human rights violation?
I mean, I could just give my pat response, which is that I don't think legislation is a useful model to intervene anyway. But given sort of the heinous nature, in particular, of some of the acts that we're talking about, I think it holds people responsible for their own expression of these embedded and these sort of enculturated ideas, if you will, but it's not an expression of an individual emotion. It is an expression of sort of social contempt, and again, it's the harm that for me, I think the harm becomes the focus. It's not so much that the intent that becomes the focus when you go to this go in this sort of direction. So that's why I'm glad that Paul follows me to talk about the harm as being the key factor to consider in sentencing. I don't think that to some extent, how do I want to put this? It does hold individuals responsible, I guess, in that interpretation for the behavior, but I think that the goal should be to punish the harm done, not necessarily to punish those expressions, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see.
Thank you, Barbara. That was phenomenal. I really enjoyed it. I know we briefly talked about this, and one concern I have over this model that tries to look at hate crimes as systematic. Vulnerable groups and so forth, is that I think it does a phenomenal job of capturing hate crimes by majorities on minorities. And I wonder in multicultural societies, especially Canada, the United States, and Western Europe, there's a lot of minority on minority hate crimes where some of these features, at least, might not be part of the aim of the hate crime. It might be a lot of just group animus that's just derived from historical. So I find that I guess I'm curious whether you think you could still use this model to try to make sense of those types of hate crimes that we intuitively want to say are still hate crimes, but don't fit the systematic oppression type model.
Yeah, I think the minority actually does fit into this, and I've made that argument in the book that members of minority groups, victimized minority groups, come into the game with the same rules of engagement, right? Are influenced by the same and additional. But let's start with the same perceptions, and so they're struggling. They're also struggling for a place in those hierarchies, right? And so, and it's funny because we don't actually the data we haven't worked with the data. Maybe, Paul, you are in the work you're doing now, but we haven't worked with the data, limited data we have available, to see what those dynamics are in reported hate crimes, to what extent it is minority and minority. The thing that I find less easy to fit into this model, and I continue to struggle with it, is minority and majority violence. Yeah, that's the piece that I continue to struggle with. But again, it's still, it's still a struggle over resources and relative relations of privilege. Mm-hmm. Hi.
So, if you're going to use the criminal law, continue to sort of have the view that the criminal law has a role to play in addressing hate crimes, you have to have a theory of the conditions that prosecutors are going to have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And of course, typically those break down prima facie as actus reus conditions. Yep. Specifying the harm that has to be proved, and then mens rea conditions specifying the mental state as to each of the elements of the act, to each of the elements of the actus reus. Now, if you were really interested in punishing harm, and you were relatively indifferent to the mental states with which that harm is perpetrated, you might have strict liability crimes that specify harms and then say, we're indifferent to the mental state you possessed when you perpetrated this harm. That you perpetrated this harm is quite enough for us. And listening to you makes me think that that's exactly the direction that you would want to go. Namely, if you really want to protect vulnerable groups that have been historically, repeatedly victimized, then what one would do is propose that you had a special form of aggravated assault, for example, aggravated theft, aggravated property damage, that simply said, if you assault a member of a historically victimized group, that is just, as a matter of strict liability, a basis for elevating your punishment. It would be like crimes, for example, that punish you extra for killing a police officer. We don't care that you didn't know it was a police officer. We protect police officers in a special way, precisely because of their uniquely vulnerable role in many crime circumstances. And it's just a matter of strict liability as to the identity of the person that you victimized. And if it's a police officer, you're going down for more time. We're not going to require a special finding of a special mental state, including knowledge or even recklessness with regard to that identity. So you could get rid of hate crimes altogether, as it were. You could get rid of the language of hate and the language of all the isms, bigotry and prejudice and so forth, if you moved in the direction of just saying it ought to be a strict liability offense, that is, a strict liability element, that you targeted a member of the following list of groups. And then you're past the worries that you currently have, because you're absolutely right. To the extent that you replace hatred with prejudice or bigotry or whatever, you're replacing it with yet another mental state that's going to require proof beyond a reasonable doubt by the prosecution. It's a mens rea state, and it seems, from your vantage point, to be under-capturing, under and perhaps even over-capturing the targeted defendants. So I guess, listening to you, my sense is that, it's an argument against hate crimes in the sense that it's an argument for strict liability as to particular groups being protected. Now, notice how difficult that is. It's very, I mean, most people, who work in the criminal law field really distrust strict liability crimes because it's fantastically unfair in many instances to elevate punishment on the basis of an aspect of the crime that the defendant didn't know about and maybe wasn't even negligent with regard to, and that's the implication of saying this.
Yep,
right?
and I understand that difficulty completely, because then it's the same sort. I mean, when we talk about hate crime against black people, right? Not every crime committed against a black person, right, is a hate crime. So how do you then determine? How do you then define which of those become subject to that legislation and
but I gather
which
you
don't?
wouldn't,
because
right?
And that's the difficulty, because it's not just, in that case, it's not just a crime is a crime is a crime. There are particular contexts, I guess, that give rise to that violence. So you do miss then, right, what it was that drove that, whether in fact it was just because simply because he was a member of a minority group, or was it because he just happened to be there and you were looking to mug someone? Could have been anyone, right? A generic crime, or a utilitarian crime, as Burke, Boyd, and Hamner would say. Yeah. So I recognize completely those those complexities. Yeah. I'm a sociologist. Come on, you solve the problems.
Initially, I quite liked the idea of oppression and the kind of cultural dominance angle that you were taking. But then I did come back to something that's been mentioned already a little bit, which is about the crime against the majority group and inter-community crime. And one of my PhD students, who actually technically doesn't start till the 1st of October, so soon to be PhD students, wants to look at inter-community crime within the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, where he has a particular problem in that to the outside world, that community presents as one. And then underneath,
internally,
there is a kind of internal politics and internal prejudice and distrust. And that is the same in some circumstances. For example, with race groups, we use a category, depending on your country, we might talk about African Americans or whatever. But actually the term and the actual makeup of that community is incredibly more complex. And there could very much be crimes that we would see as hate crimes, at least on a theoretical level, that wouldn't then fall into a definition. I recently did a lecture panel debate on Radio 4 in the UK talking about hate crime. And there were a number of different perspectives on the panel and a wide public audience. And somebody said something along the lines of, well, if we broadened hate crime to include a number of different groups, what if somebody committed a hate crime against somebody who's a member of the fascist party, or the British National Party in the UK? And there was a certain amount of sniggering from the audience. But as I said in the closing remarks, I said, if we want to have a liberal society that has this concept of hate crime that applies to all these different groups, then you have to accept sometimes that a hate crime might well be allowed to protect somebody who, when you were thinking about it, wasn't in your mind. And that was going to be my response to you, in the sense that if we're going to define a wide-ranging definition of hate crime, then it might be that we just have to accept that there are groups that, when we're thinking about it, we might not have in our mind, who might then be able to afford protection. And the answer then, I would say, is then that individual can avail themselves of the criminal justice system in exactly the same way as somebody who is part of a group that's been oppressed for 100 years or more. And I think it's important for us to kind of tease out a little bit these distinctions this way.
Two things, actually. One is that the Canadian legislation is really interesting because it lists crimes motivated by whatever towards how many groups? 8 identified groups, and then it says, or any similar group. So that has been read to mean groups who have been similarly disadvantaged and marginalized historically. So it is explicitly directed towards, disadvantaged groups. The second piece was that I thank you, all of you, actually, for noting, sort of the majority violence, because perhaps that if we think more about that, that allows us to think about even different sorts of language that might be. So that's one thing I'm going to go home with already, is given that because it's not really oppressive. Right? It's sort of fighting for position, so positional violence or positioning violence or something like that. Or even, one of the terms that I didn't use here, but I've seen some in the literature is Gail Mason, for example, othering, violence of othering, that sort of thing. So again, a very academic term, not very useful, I think, as a title for a piece of legislation. But those dynamics, I think, really have to enter into our thinking about this. So I appreciate that.
Okay, last question.
Okay, thanks. Is this on?
Yep.
It is on. All right, great. So thanks. I thought it was brilliant too, but I did have a kind of similar worry that has come up here with respect to the distinguishing between kind of opportunistic crime that just happens to target a minority. So I thought that there might be something, after all, to the notion of hate crime. I mean, one thing that hate motivation that's distinctive about it is that it's not if you hate someone, you want something bad to happen to them. not because it's instrumentally good for some other kind of end and so on.
Yeah.
So, so then I started wondering why do you have to sort of choose between these two kind of you know, it's either we talk about hate or we talk about this targeted violence. I mean, couldn't we just rather try to focus on a specific kind of hate with a particular kind of etiology, say, and a particular kind of object where it's you know it's a hate that targets a group rather than an individual, or that's the sort of states that is at issue. So we don't really have to choose between talking about hate and talking about the harm or the group that we're, but just talk about a specific you know, kind of hate perhaps, and that way try to solve both of these problems. You know? We're not talking about every crime targeting this group or members of this group, but we're not just talking about any kind of hate, but just particular. So
we're talking about identity-based violence in that respect, and I think this is where the UK legislation is a good model, because it's not this generic hate crime legislation. It's racial violence, religious violence, and now homophobic and and disablest violence. So in legislative terms, perhaps it is possible to proceed in that direction, as opposed to sort of the academic discussions that we might have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.